Well, good morning, everybody. I feel very humble and speaking after this excellent presentation by Mr. Kaunda, not least since he's carrying a name which fills us Europeans with a lot of respect. Once the name Kaunda more or less meant the father of the new independent Africa. So I have personal experience from nation branding. We didn't call it that at that time in the 1990s. We called it country promotion. If we wanted to be even more modest, we would say simply information about your country. Then from around the millennium, turn of the millennium, we started internationally calling it nation branding, using, of course, the terminology which is dominated by market forces. So nation branding of Sweden was what I did in big parts of the 1990s. And since 10 years or 8 or 10 years here in Berlin, I'm regularly speaking about nation branding in a general sense. But I'm not an Africa specialist. I've been to many African countries, and I have many African friends, but you will excuse me if I cannot be so much down to the details and the heart and the soul of Africa, which I would very much love to present, but which was so wonderfully presented, the Zambian case this morning. So,
No, because you opened by mistake. That's it.
What did I do?
No.
Now I can go. Huh?
Yeah.
Yeah. Why do I have two here? I want only one at the time.
You have the current and the next.
Okay, for me, it's okay. It's okay.
The current
So,
is in big and the next
yeah.
in the small.
Okay. Very good. Nation branding, as I said, it's of course an accommodation to the global market, to globalization. So we are speaking about global competition. And in this global competition, mainly entrepreneurs and big companies and conglomerates are competing with each other on a global level. Some becoming very rich and very powerful, others fighting very hard for their survival. Anyway, this private competition in the global world is also reflected, has become reflected in the national competition. So we speak here about a global competition between countries. All countries must compete with each other to share the to have its share of the world's consumers, the tourists, the conferences, investors, students, patients, entrepreneurs, international sporting and cultural events, and also the attention and respect of the international media, other governments, and the people of other nations. So it's an enormous competition. And of course, this competition tends to be usually won by the big players. But there might be chances in this global competition also for smaller players to be discovered. And that is one of the challenges of nation branding. So if we were to speak very generally about Africa, almost each African country, particularly the southern ones, could really claim to represent the cradle of mankind. So, of course, that would be a brand or a slogan which is really unbeatable. and it would be very efficient in whatever marketing competition connection around the world. So sometimes I'm almost surprised that it is not used more, because it is a fantastic, if you allow me, selling argument. It is an argument which is relevant for all the 50 plus African countries. Now, then there are some countries who are doing nation branding without any effort at all. They don't need any effort because they are already so well known. Let's speak about, for instance, you mentioned the former colonial power, Great Britain. All the rest of us in the world, we can only envy them because they have three absolutely unbeatable arguments which will put them very much in the front for a very long time. They have the language. As you mentioned, Zambia used language as the compromise language, and so do the Indians, and so do we here in ICD. How many of you are from United Kingdom in this room? There you are. Nobody. Nobody. So we are all communicating in our sort of English. Sometimes we communicate in bad English. But some Englishmen, when wanting to be kind to us, they say, "Oh, you speak better than people do up in Newcastle or Yorkshire or whatever." So anyway, we are trying our best, but that has been the solution. This compromise has been the solution for us. So the language is a very strong argument for them. They have BBC, the World Service, which can be heard everywhere and which also I listen to every day almost, and which is, of course, a fantastic argument. And not last but not least, they have Premier League, which is looked upon all over the world, and Manchester United and Arsenal and Chelsea and so on, they have their fans all over the place, and they get an enormous advantage and benefit from that fact. And then, of course, they have this couple. These days, of course, we ask ourselves, are these two people here, Mr. Bond and the Queen, are they now walking out of Europe? Or is it simply a confirmation of this old Rule Britannia principle, which was more or less prevailing until around 1960? So this, by the way, was, of course, one of the smartest nation branding PR coups in nation branding history. You remember when this was taken, this film? It was the Olympic Games in London 2012, and the Queen had allowed Craig to come into Buckingham Palace to film this and so on. So this was a coup. Now, the contrast to this, does anybody know which this country is?
Kosovo?
Yeah, I hear Kosovo.
Here, behind.
Right, it is Kosovo. And I would say that is almost the opposite, because it's a country fighting for its independence. They declared their independence as the Republic of Kosovo in 2008. They are so far recognized by about 110 countries in the world, but they are not yet members of the United Nations. They are members, as far as I remember, of the UEFA, but not of FIFA, etc., etc. So they have a long and hard uphill battle to get the recognition, to be recognized and to be discovered by the rest of the world. On top of this, it's a little poor, landlocked country in the Balkans, and their nationality is something which is also interesting. They speak Albanian, their neighboring country, they speak Albanian. So they have a state, but the nation since nation is very much connected to the concept of language, nation is perhaps rather Albanian, complicated and very difficult. So this is a contrast. Now, when we speak about nation branding, I have a friend in London called Simon Anholt. And some of you may have heard about him. He was more or less the person who first introduced the concept of nation branding, starting calling this nation branding rather than country promotion and so on. And he has created this hexagon, which is more or less giving you the 6 main areas which you wish to promote by your brand. And the 6 main areas in the countries in the country that you wish to benefit from efficient and successful nation branding. Tourism we spoke about this morning, and this is of course a very clear and a distinct field where you can have success, you can find the niche. And the good news, I think, here for nation branding all over the world, for all the 193 plus countries in the world, the good news is that the interest in tourism, generally speaking, is so big that people are fed up with the old tourist destinations, and they want to discover something new. They want to be able to send a selfie from exotic places which nobody have heard about before. That is the big chance, of course, because otherwise the big risk about nation branding is that plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. The more it changes, the more it's the same thing. And you have everybody, the big countries and the medium countries and the small countries are all investing in nation branding. And the result will be, of course, that the richer are the winners. Or not that the winner takes it all, as Abba says, but it's at least the hierarchy between success and loser will be more or less the same. But the tourism may be an exception. And of course, the closely linked to the tourism is the people. And if the people happens to speak this lingua franca, English, the chances are bigger. Of course, you would say in today's economy, where China is the new superpower, together with the United States, you would say that China would take all tourists in the world, because such a big, fantastic country. But they don't. Why? Probably because the language is still a big bottleneck in terms of communicating with foreign visitors. The kind of invitation that Mr. Kaunda just gave us cannot happen in a suburb of Chengdu in Middle China, for instance. It cannot simply happen because the language obstacles are still too big. So there's a big chance, of course, for countries which the people of which are speaking English, or for that sake, French, another big global language, or for that sake, Spanish, or for that sake, Russian, to mention a few of the really big languages in the world. Now, when it comes to exports, that is, of course, a big, because here, everybody, every country, every company involved in production and exportation is faced by these problems that I mentioned in the global economy. You are fighting against giants. And not every little company around the world can be the David who can overcome Goliath. So the chances for exports are, of course, for small players much smaller than in, let's say, if we speak about tourism, or even if we speak about investment, the competitive power. And here's, of course, here we have also a very fundamental historically based economic problem. And that is the fact that the rich continent Africa, with all its raw materials in so many countries, have been and still are exploited. Okay, that is one of the narratives that you didn't sign, but of course there's still a lot of such exploitation going on, let's face it, which means that the national owner of some raw materials is not benefiting, or the people is not benefiting to the extent that objectively seen should be the case. So in terms of exportation, there is still, of course, a lot to do, and the global economy is not particularly just. There is a lot to do. As you heard, for some time, I was dealing with the World Trade Organization also, and I would say equality or justice in world trade has still a very long way to go. And Africa belongs to the African countries, belong to those who are still have a lot to gain in this. And I agree with this. Better negotiations, and there may be progress. Culture and heritage is the other big chance for any less known country in the world. And that goes very closely together with tourism. I went to one of the typical destinations of tourism last week, was in Sicily, in Italy, and went, of course, to Syracuse and to the old Greek temples and the old Roman, with the Greek theater and the Roman Colosseum there, etc. These are typical South European cultural heritage, which is part of tourism. African countries have very much to offer in terms of cultural heritage, and also, of course, of active culture, or the culture of tomorrow. And that is, so I would put a very strong link here between, as you see also in the Hexter, between culture and heritage, people and tourism. Big chances, and still not utilized chances, I would say. Investments and immigration. Well, investment, some people are asking themselves, why do we put investment and integration in one breath here? Well, of course, because immigration and investment are going together. If you find a country attractive, you are likely to go there and to try to take the risk to invest there, and you will also be prepared to live there for some time or for the rest of your life and so on. So that is a very important part of the attractiveness of your country. And here is still, of course, a lot to do, and let's face it, there are certain parts of Central Africa or just Sahelian parts of Africa which are not likely in the near future to be high up on the list regarding investment and immigration. But the more has to be done in terms of development assistance and cooperation. Finally, on this hexagon, governance. And I guess now you will not be surprised when I say, well, here we have a problem, perhaps. Because this is talking about reputation and image. We will probably be in agreement that the word corruption has been so dominating in recent years that, let's say, our trust in the democratic, efficient system of many African countries is not there. Take only the difference between South Africa 15 years ago, at the time when Nelson Mandela was still alive, and today when President Zuma is facing one vote after the other in order in the parliament just to survive as a president. So we have a problem, or Africa has a problem here in terms of governance. And this is an interesting discussion because it has to be discussed probably what type of democracy is the most relevant in various parts of Africa. You read now in the papers about the effects of the Kenyan election last week, and this tradition is almost a tradition in many countries to oppose the official result of the election. So governance and the stability in that field, I think, is a problem. Now, there's also the question, what is, when we are speaking about nation branding, we have the concept nation, which I said is very closely linked to language and culture. We have country, which is more or less a geographical phenomenon, and we have state, which is the legal aspect of it, with the government and the institutions, etc. And land is also, again, let's say, the physical part of it. But I hear many African friends saying, like these Kenyan scholar said some years ago, we got a state, but did not build a nation. And that is always, what is building a nation? You know, that is, of course, building institutions, building a reliable and functioning democratic system. All these very difficult issues belong to the challenges of a relatively new country. Now, generally speaking, again, very general, there are exceptions and there are better stories and there are bad stories, etc., etc. But how the poverty trap is, of course, one thing when we speak about nation branding. That always you say Africa and you immediately think of poverty and the big problems and the almost hopeless situation for many citizens of various countries and so on. So nation branding is, of course, how to show the positive side. This is one of the challenges, to show the world that this is a continent of opportunities. And there are many ways of showing that, of course. I mentioned a few already, not only in tourism, but the continent of opportunities is, of course, one of the slogans that should be used also country-wise, or perhaps even region-wise, when we come to big, complicated countries like Nigeria, for instance. And then how to avoid the development recipient cliche. I spent many years of my life in development assistance. So I know what it's like, and I know also the risk when certain come from the so-called generous part of the world called Scandinavia, where the development assistance is traditionally around 1% of the GNP. But we were also aware when dealing with many countries, like some African countries and like Bangladesh, for instance, that a very large part of the whole the government budget becomes development aid related. And this is, of course, one problem. And the other problem is that you may start thinking only in terms poor them, lucky us. And that is another problem. Now, again, the risk of becoming a victim of neocolonialism. Well, you said no country no country lets somebody invest or be there without invitation. You are certainly right. And that we speak about China in the African continent has to do also with the fact that we find China everywhere. Chinese investors where you find in Latin America, you find them in London, you find them in all over Europe, and they are the biggest proprietor of the United States currency reserve. So China has a kind of neo-colonial role. It's not the same as the old colonial, but it's a new type of role. And they are doing this together to some extent with the Gulf states. The Gulf states are also important actors in this field. And it has, here, of course, you have to defend your own interest. And that has to be part of not only nation branding, but part of the policy of each government to stand up and be self-confident enough to make a good negotiation, to make a good deal whenever a foreign investor is around. So that is the big challenge. And then a bigger and a global challenge is, of course, how to defend African sustainability. These days, our thoughts are going very much to all the hundreds of poor people in Sierra Leone who succumbed a terrible natural disaster. And this is, of course, one example of what is happening with the climate change and with the shrinking land, because after all, land is shrinking. Again, the Sahel district, land is shrinking. The forests are threatened. The species, of course, very much threatened. And all these sustainable, all these resources of the rich continent Africa are threatened. So, I mentioned already to defend the raw materials against exploitation, and then also encourage some very good examples around the continent of regional cooperation. Of course, in the best of worlds, the African Union should be working like in direction like the European Union. We are really trying to integrate more and more and take all the win-win possibilities that exist in a stronger and more developed cooperation. But you have regional cooperations like the Nile Basin, the Chad Basin, the Zambezi Basin, and these are fantastic possibilities for development. There's one thing more which I think goes not only for Africa but for the whole world. Some of you who will be in Berlin in the coming weeks will see a little bit of a debate, a political debate about equality. Because what we are seeing, and that is one of the effects, let's face it, of globalization, the difference between rich and poor have been widened in the last 30 years, and that is a very serious thing. And it is, of course, particularly for the poor people, it is not acceptable. But it's also for, let's say, for a society, if it becomes if the difference becomes too big, there will be a big threat against stability of the society. And again, I mention once more the fight against corruption. So these are some of the challenges, but the fundamental challenges, again, is the poverty, the growing gap between rich and poor. We also have some that is too much neglected, I feel, in the international debate, the population explosion. Are you aware that 4.8 children per woman, that is the average fertility in Africa? Again, the Sahel countries are on top of this list. In Niger, there are 7.4 children per woman. The women there, or the girls, I would say, marry in average before the age of 15. So the situation of women is something which definitely has to be improved. If that is improved, if education is given to all girls, and also reminding them of the United Nations objectives and goals, for instance, that nobody should have to marry before age of 18, then automatically, and perhaps also with the help of some contraceptives and so on, you will be able to bring down this fertility rate, which is difficult to handle for many countries. Corruption, I already mentioned. The trade deficit is, I also mentioned, and not last but not least, the religious conflicts is, of course, something that is a terrible burden for many countries. And I could only hope that religious fanaticism would take a few steps back, and that respect for others, for other beliefs and other religions, including not believing in any God, that would be somehow respected much more than it seems to be the case. It's a growing tendency of religious conflicts, unfortunately. Well, the strongest case you can make for nation branding is to have political credibility. I already mentioned Nelson Mandela. I could add Kenneth Kaunda. And with such type of African leaders, we know that the nation branding comes almost by itself. Finally, I just wish to mention what are the organizational challenges. You, of course, have to have well-functioning embassies, and cultural institutes can also be helpful, cultural centers, and then you can have campaigns. But the problem with a campaign is, of course, that is something, it comes today, and it's there tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow it's forgotten again. So the more sustainable type of nation branding is certainly to be recommended. Universal exhibitions are taking place every 5 years. Next time will be in Dubai in 2020, and it's definitely a recommendation to try to participate in such exhibitions. And of course, to also participate in other exhibitions. You mentioned the tourist fair here in Berlin, to show people here, I am here, we exist, come. That is the kind of main message of a ambitious, more, let's say, or the embryo of a nation branding. I always feel, as I said, that strengthening of the AU would be important, and the TV channels, I know that, for instance, in many parts of Africa, they are looking at Nollywood films. They are produced mainly in Nigeria, but they are also looked upon everywhere, and that is certainly something which is giving people a good time, and also promoting the image of the respective country. The film festivals are important. Ouagadougou Film Festival is very respected all over the world, and the events like, well, the biggest event of all, of course, World Cup in football took place in South Africa 2010, and was a great success, and certainly contributed a lot to the image of South Africa. Nation branding is not free of charge. It costs. Not very much. I think the benefit of that is much bigger than the investment. So it's a good investment if a government really tries to set aside, to allocate a substantial sum for nation branding. That will absolutely be of great importance for the future. And then you have one asset which I haven't mentioned yet, but is of course the most important of all, and that is the artists themselves. We are speaking cultural diplomacy, and cultural diplomacy is about arts and culture to a very large extent. And you have these people who are performing, who are painting, or also those who are, let's say, in the intellectual debates of the world. The contribution that your people of arts and culture can do is immense. And particularly, and there's again a chance which you have also through the media and social media and so on. So don't forget to support your own artists. But, and this is my final word, unfortunately, good nation branding may be successful and may give people a good impression for some time. But if politics is bad or the society is not functioning well, in the long run, it can't be hidden by good nation branding. So you have to start by having good politics and a good society, good economy, good culture, and so on. And on basis of that, nation branding could be successful. Thank you very much.